Okay, so welcome to the Division G podcast series. Launched in 2014 by the AERA Graduate Student Executive Committee, these podcasts provide an added medium to highlight scholarship, discuss contemporary issues, and start a conversation among DivG members and the greater community. This year, we are launching our first webinar series, which will become podcasts leading up to the annual spring conference in San Antonio. For an archive of our podcast, please visit aeradivg.wordpress.com. Also, be sure to join our Facebook group, AERA Division G Students Social Context of Education, and follow us on Twitter at AERA DivG. Thank you. So thank you for joining us, and we are very happy to be your host this afternoon. My name is Shayna Sanchez, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of California, Los Angeles.
And my name is Adam Musser, and I'm a second-year PhD student in Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
And for the first time in Division G's history, we are recording today's podcast through a webinar. And we're very excited to welcome Dr. Michelle Purdy from Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Terrance Green from the University of Texas in Austin, and Dr. Timothy San Pedro from The Ohio State University, for our conversation on the role of social context within the theme of our annual meeting, which is achieving the promise of equal educational opportunity. We're going to begin by asking our guests a few questions, then we're going to open it up to our audience. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box and click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen to open it up, and we'll call on you to ask you your question in the end, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can.
I would also like to welcome our participating scholars, and I have a few questions to get us started. Number one is the easy one. Would you please each introduce yourself and tell us where you're working and what is your area of scholarship? Dr. Purdy, we'll start with you.
Okay, sure. Thanks again for inviting me to be a part of this. This is great. Congratulations to you all on continuing the podcast series. So I am currently an assistant professor of education here at Washington University in St. Louis. I am located in a department of education within the Greater Arts and Sciences unit or school here at WashU. And my research generally focuses on the history of education in the United States, the history of African American education in the United States, school desegregation policy, and generally I'm concerned with issues of race, culture, and equity writ large. So that takes place in my research, my teaching, and also my service as well.
Thank you. Dr. Green?
Hello. First, I'd just like to say as well, thank you all for having us, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. My name is Terrance Green, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin in the Department of Educational Administration, which houses our educational policy and planning program, as well as our leadership preparation. And my research follows two lines of inquiry. The first one is I've always been interested in this nexus between urban school reform and equitable community development, but particularly the roles of principals and community leaders within that context. And then secondly, I've been interested in this idea of the geography of educational opportunity, particularly how does space and place and race impact the educational opportunities that children have access to. And more recently, I just started a study here in Austin on gentrification in schools, really trying to understand, number one, how do school leaders make sense of gentrification? But then secondly, how do school leaders, from an organizational perspective, how do they respond to the impacts of gentrification on their schools? And so happy to talk more about any of those lines of research, but super duper excited to be here with you all. And thank you.
Thank you. Dr. San Pedro?
Thank you for having us and for creating the space for us to be together and to learn with one another. I'm at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. I'm in the Department of Teaching and Learning, and we have areas of study here, and my area of study is multicultural and equity studies in education. And my scholarship thus far has focused on the ways in which curriculum and pedagogy, when it shifts from Eurocentric perspectives in classrooms and in schools, how that impacts motivation and engagement for both Native and non-Native students, particularly when the curriculum is shifting and recentering Indigenous knowledges in those spaces. And lately I've been thinking about ways in which to create spaces at university levels where colonization has had such an impact that identity is complicated and where it's not necessarily attached to land or to place, and thinking about ways in which we can revitalize languages, cultures in spaces that don't necessarily have a whole lot of Indigenous peoples in this location. So again, happy to be here with you all, and I'm looking forward to learning with you.
Thank you to each of you. We hope that this can be more of a conversation. So probably I'm not going to call on you anymore, and we'll just talk. So whoever wants to take up this first question, please just jump right in. The theme of the 2017 ARA annual meeting is achieving the promise of equal educational opportunity. How do you see this theme relating to the work that you are doing or trying to do or thinking about doing right now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can start there in the sense of the work that I do currently. The main project right now is a book-length project that looks at how and why historically white K through 12 elite private schools decided to desegregate in the moment of school desegregation in the civil rights era when they were not legally obligated to do so. And subsequently, the experiences of some of the first Black students to attend one of these schools in Atlanta, Georgia. And so in the notion of thinking about achieving the promise of educational opportunity, it had me thinking about the fact that it's not just the provision of the opportunity, right? So in the case of when we look at school desegregation, there's been obviously so much work done on school desegregation, and rightfully so in public schools. And as someone who wants to expand how we think about the Black educational experience in this country to look at a different institutional setting, one could, stop the story at and say, okay, it's about that initial provision, right? And the ways in which, and I think it's important, and my book focuses on the ways in which this first desegregation generation navigated this elite space. But it's not just the provision of the opportunity, like I said, right? It goes to the quality of the experience, the ways in which students themselves have to rely on what they bring to the institution and not necessarily institutional change that afforded them the ability to succeed there. And so I think we have to continuously push ourselves to think about not just quantity or the fact that barriers have been broken, but what is the quality of those experiences in any type of school setting, whether it's K through 12 or higher ed. I think our young people, obviously on college campuses, are pushing us today to think about the quality of that experience in higher education. And of course, the activists with Black Lives Matter and all of us who are trying to stay woke, right? The quality of being a person of color or whatever identity you might have and valued here in the United States. So, and especially in the rise of anti-Blackness and state violence. So.
Awesome. I concur. I totally agree with that. And I would just add with my scholarship, the way I think it addresses the theme for this or next year's ARA conference is, and thinking about particularly school reform and equitable community development, how then do we address opportunity gaps that impact achievement gaps? And so for the longest, there's been this discourse about achievement gaps, which we can definitely critique and talk about some of the complexities and contradictions within that. And not saying that students shouldn't achieve academically, but to decontextualize that from the opportunity structures in which children navigate, to me, is a very myopic and narrow perspective. And so we know from scholars like Prudence Carter and Kevin Wellner and Rich Milner and Gloria Ladson-Billings that there's this whole idea of opportunity gaps. And so when we're thinking about school reform and equitable community development, we're trying to say, hold on, there are some very real issues before you even hit the school that have to be addressed. And so if you don't address the opportunity gaps, these out of school factors that significantly shape the experiences that children have in schools, then you'll end up with what Charles Payne said. You got so much reform, but so little change, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the goal really of my work is to eliminate opportunity gaps, so then we can start talking about achievement. And then secondly, the whole idea about the geography of educational opportunity, I've been interested in like this tension and wrestling with the idea of a geography of educational opportunity, which sometimes could be somewhat deterministic, and really been interested in this idea of the opportunity within the geography. Or in other words, how do people exercise their agency within context of oppression? Because if you look historically, people of color, particularly African Americans, we have always exuded agency within the context of oppression. And so how do we think about the opportunity in the geography, not just to look on that to negate structural inequality and systemic inequality, but it's not an either or about opportunity and geography of opportunity. It's a both and. So when I think about the theme, I think about my work connecting within those two ways.
And I think one other piece to that is thinking about how opportunity is actually created, right? And so the ways in which not only African Americans have exhibited agency and other people who've been oppressed from the moments in which they've been first oppressed in this country, right, or this land, I should say, before it was even the United States of America, but the ways in which opportunity is actually afforded and the constellation of factors that have to take place, seemingly in order for marginalized people to just get a foot in the door, right? So you have to have this constellation of agency and activism, as well as policy and seemingly moral compass and major events that then move the general population, right, or the dominant population in ways that they haven't been moved before. And so how do we move from these constellation of factors that grant opportunity to what Dr. Green also talked about? What does this mean for long-term achievement for marginalized populations in the U.S.? So,
all right, thank you, both of you. Yeah, I was just thinking while you both were talking about how sort of we position research and people who do research as sort of this top-down approach, where if we build it, envision it, construct it, fund it, others will feel that impact. And I think rather we ought to consider how we are entering into spaces. Are we invited into those spaces? Are we listening to build with what's been constructed or what's already underway? And I think we have to stop kidding ourselves that the work we do is so crucial and so central that communities are waiting for us to find solutions. And like what you said, Terrance, they are already discovering solutions, and we ought to serve as like supports to those efforts and add our knowledges when asked and when invited to do so. And I'm thinking about what's happening in Standing Rock and the initiatives that are happening there. Schools are being constructed, schools are being created, like Freedom Square in Chicago. There are multiple examples of schools that are educational spaces that are being constructed in the absence of us, right?
Okay, we're going to start back up with you, Dr. San Pedro. I'm not going to ask you to remember exactly what you said, but I had a few notes. If you could just revisit this idea of a critical approach to research as top-down, and how researchers in the academy perceive our work and entering into spaces. Maybe we've been invited to those spaces and maybe we haven't, and how we are supposed to think about, or should be thinking about always, aiding and serving community initiatives that are already in place, because we are not the center of the answers.
Yeah, I don't need to say anything. No, I was just connecting with Michelle and Terrance on their work and where their thoughts are leading. I was just saying that oftentimes we think of research as sort of this trickle down effect, or trickle down economics, where we hold the holders of knowledge, and all of a sudden somehow it trickles down into the community. So like if we build it or envision it, construct it, fund it, others will somehow magically feel that impact. And I do think that there's good research that does that, but I think rather we ought to be considering how we are entering into those spaces, into those communities, into relationships with people. Are we invited into those, or are we just pushing our agendas into these spaces? Are we listening to build with what's been constructed or what's already underway? And I think I was saying something to the effect of, we have to stop kidding ourselves that the work we do is so crucial and so central. The communities are waiting for us to find solutions. They are discovering solutions already, and we have to serve as supports to those efforts and add our knowledges when asked and when invited to do so. So that's really in conjunction with a lot of decolonizing research, Linda Smith's research, Eve Tuck's damage versus desire-based research, Patel's answerability, Jeremy Garcia, Valerie Shirley, sacred school spaces. And then I shared a story about being at this conference in my hometown in Western Montana, where a couple of Maori scholars from New Zealand said, our life's work should not be in translating ourselves to others, but to articulate our understandings to ourselves and our relations. And I think that there's a lot of power within that, because so much of our energies is in, hoping that somebody sees the legitimacy in the work and in the knowledges that we bring from our families, from our communities. And rather than spending so much time and effort in the translation, using those energies to articulate our understandings of ourselves and our relations, and constructing, creating, analyzing, and forwarding methods, methodologies, theories that have made sense to us for so long and have made sense to our families, our communities, our friends, our relations. And just to come back to the question itself of how our research is connected to that, I'm working with Montana State University professor and friend Sweeney Wintreef on forwarding a co-edited book called Indigenous Research Methods, where we're attempting to do that work of understanding what Indigenous research methods look like in different spaces, in different contexts, in different countries, and seeing the similarities and differences in how those are applied, and how community and local knowledges are forwarding those efforts.
Thank you. I guess I'll maybe give Dr. Green or Dr. Purdy just a minute or a lot of minutes if you want to respond to anything that Dr. San Pedro said.
Well, I think what's interesting about what Dr. San Pedro said is if we're thinking about obviously contemporary research, right, grounded in social context of education, and thinking about, especially if you're doing research with communities that are marginalized and that have been historically marginalized, right, what it means to enter those spaces in a contemporary moment, what does it mean to be invited or not to be invited, how do you gain trust, right, especially those of us who are at these Research One institutions where there are often town gown relationships, and as soon as you say the name of the institution where you are working, it's like, I don't know about that, right? And that translates to the work that those of us who are working with marginalized populations and historical work are also facing, right? And so in thinking about the ways in which we engage, because we often know, right, archival research will only take you so far, because so oftentimes those who've been marginalized, don't trust the state institutions of archival work to leave their repositories with them, right, because of the mistrust factor, right? So we have to turn to other methods, including oral history, including drawing on some of those qualitative research methods in terms of how do you gain trust for people who have been marginalized, but whose stories you feel are necessary and important to understand a full African American or whatever population you're looking at experience. And so I think there's overlap in these conversations that can happen, right, between the past and the present when doing research and how we engage research methodologies, in terms of especially this piece of, are you invited in, are you not, how do you gain trust, and what do you do with that trust ultimately, right? What does it mean to, once you secure that trust, how do you honor that trust in the work that you do, in the stories that you tell, and the research that you present, and the frameworks that you're using for that research. And again, people have already had solutions in the past. They've had solutions. They're making solutions now in the present. So what is our work, as researchers and as scholars and as teachers, in advancing, hopefully, equitable solutions to the issues that we have today?
Yeah, I agree 1,000% with what they both said, and I'll just simply add what I hear them saying. It makes me think about, too, particularly for doctoral students, the importance to really dig into things like epistemology and ontology. And I talk a lot in my classes about this whole thing that new ways of seeing creates new ways of being. Margaret Letwith talks about, who is a researcher who does critical community development work in the UK. But that idea of how do we see differently, but that's also attached to how can we be differently, right? So getting away from these westernized notions of what knowledge is, of what research is, of this, even the whole idea of translation versus authenticity and articulation, who you exactly are. And so that would be my call, kind of hearing what they're saying, is like really digging into deeply to interrogate one's own epistemological and ontological dispositions, because that significantly informs the very questions that you ask, the very methods and methodologies that you employ, the very theoretical frameworks that you apply when you're doing research. And that even speaks to the idea that we need new questions. We need new theoretical lenses and new theoretical frames to make sense of what's happening in communities. And so I agree 1,000% with what they said, and just to challenge students to really continuously interrogate those ontological and epistemological dispositions that we bring to our research.
And I think to forward that is just to foreground it in the realities of our society, and framing it within what it is that we are in. We are in a settler colonial state where there's logics and legacies that are still in place. And I see that. And it's so important that we move from what schooling has taught us is like, what do you know, or what are you able to know? Rather, we should be thinking about how have we come to know, and how do we use that knowledge to forward the relations, communities, and peoples that we work with.
Thank you, everybody. I want to take up this idea of new lenses and frames and new logics and legacies to maybe approach the ARA meeting theme this year critically. And so I wonder if you want to speak to this idea of equal educational opportunities in the United States, and whether you think this is a narrative of real progress, or is it a cultural myth that we are telling ourselves, or is it something else? Is that framing of equal educational opportunities itself a problem?
I mean, I think that when we use these key words, we really need to distill down what it is that we're meaning by these words, right? And I don't think that they were just chosen by happenstance. I mean, even the title of this talk is The Role of Social Context in Achieving the Promise of Equal Educational Opportunity. And when I read the call again, I don't know if we're necessarily considering the full social context of what it means to have such a promise, or what it means to have equality or equity, or whose educational purposes are served, or what opportunities are given. I think even distilling it down to like who possesses knowledge, and when is that knowledge valued and validated. There's a scholar, Batiste, who said, knowledge is not what some possess and others do not. Knowledge is not a commodity that can be possessed or controlled by educational institutions, but is a living process to be absorbed and understood. And I think that the way that that the theme this year was maybe framed, in my mind, is sort of set up in this deficit notion where these communities and places are having issues. And I'm not trying to say that they don't, but they're not framed in what we were talking about earlier. They're not framed within the larger narrative, settler colonialism. And so if we aren't talking, or if we're not speaking to the painful historical relations of people in this nation that have been built upon the theft of land and the profiting of that land off the stolen Black bodies, then what are we talking about? And so I think we need to start and recognize the social context, the spaces and places that we're in, the air that we breathe, right? To make further sense of this promise that we're attempting to achieve in education.
Right. And picking up off of Tim, you know, the long the long social context in some ways, right? Thinking about social context at particular moments and times and spaces as this educational system, as this schooling system has developed, right? And for whom did it serve at what times, and for whom did it not serve, right? And to continue to interrogate what did those spaces and places mean, and then as Du Bois would say, what happened behind the veil, right? So obviously James Anderson's work, Vanessa Siddle Walker's work, the list goes on in terms of those of who investigated what happened in the South, right? So even with limited resources, unequal funding, right? We know that there was some good happening in Black schools, right? We know that there was some good happening even when Mexican Americans were segregated out West or in the Southwest, that there was still good happening in those schools, right? And happening in those communities and in those families. In the same way with, David Adams' still classic book, right? Education for Extinction, looking at the Native American boarding school experience, right? And the tensions that those students felt when they would go off to the boarding school but come back home. And so that's real, right? So we have to, when we think about this promise of educational opportunity, we have to think about it in terms of a macro view. So one could say, yes, there's been progress, right? So the high school has developed over time. We have more people now graduating at the aggregate, more people than ever proportionally graduating from high school. But again, we have to disaggregate those numbers and see for whom does that meet, who's that 83%? Because it's not African-American students, it's not Hispanic American students, it's not Native American students, it's not some Asian American students, right? And so we have to disaggregate these numbers. And then we have to ask, even if you're graduating from high school, under what circumstances are you graduating? What are the standards in the curriculum that is in place? What is the curriculum that you're learning that could be disempowering to your actual existence, right, in this country, right, that was built on, as we know, as Tim so eloquently talked about, right, literally the stealing of land and the profiting off of bodies and land, right? So we have to problematize these words, and again, it kind of goes back to quality of experience, right, and to ask ourselves, what is the quality of the experience now, and then also considering the political economy. What does a high school degree get you now in the United States? Right? We are now in a knowledge-based economy. So we can celebrate these higher, rates of high school graduation, but in the real world, what is that actually getting people, right? And how do particular groups of people continue to be marginalized within the political economy as well? So I just think we have to really be careful with, similar to what Tim said, and this comes from, and this is something I encourage the graduate students, have colleagues outside of your realm. Right. I was fortunate to be in an interdisciplinary program at Emory. So I have colleagues who are studying critical literacy, critical math, critical social studies, being critical teacher education work, be in conversation with a multitude of scholars, right? Because then they push your thinking, so thanks to my critical literacy scholar friends, I question every word that we use now because we have to think about the meanings of these words, right? And what does progress mean in the United States? I mean, and again, that becomes, as a historian, taking a long view, yes, I can say there's particular progress on maybe a quantifiable level or in terms of obviously laws and policies, but we have to continuously ask ourselves, what does progress mean within the moment in which we're talking about these things? So yeah, great question.
Yeah. Just taking notes. All good stuff.
It is.
I was thinking about, so I want to add to Dr. Purdy's thought, the part about reading widely. And I would also add to read some stuff outside of education research. Like yes. Education scholars, like we don't have a monopoly on, you know what I'm saying? Like read, there are many disciplines and many fields that I believe education researchers should be reading that can significantly inform what they do. But to only stay in a college of education or a school of education during your graduate program, to me, it could be a limited experience. So I definitely want to add to that. So when we think about the idea of equal educational opportunities, so I think that's the paradox, particularly for folks of color in this country, right? So when you think about equal, if we even just critically interrogated that, equal to whom, right? Yeah. And so now the standard becomes this equal to whiteness. That's what's tacitly and implicitly asserted when we talk about that. And it goes back to something Asa Hilliard said, white folks shouldn't be the standard for achievement that you want, right? And so equal to whom becomes a question. And isn't that what I want? Do I want exactly what white folks have? Is that it? And so really thinking about equal educational opportunities and equal to whom, and how that sets everyone else up to be othered and versus white. And so I think that's something that we have to trouble and we critique. And so this is the paradox with it too, right? Because I think there is great utility in deconstruction and critiquing, but at the same time, there also has to be reconstruction and recreation in a sense, because, you know, I remember being in grad school and everybody like, oh, we just gonna blow it up and all this other stuff. And that was a very good, you know, philosophical, theoretical exercise and discourse for a very privileged University of Wisconsin in Madison education. That's where I went to graduate school, right? So that's all cool, but there are also very real realities that people engage in every day. And this is not to obscure the strengths and obscure the knowledges that people have and that they bring. And this is that paradox that I'm talking about, right? So on one end, equal to whom, but then on the other end, how can you colonize an entire people and there not be any reparations or any redistribution of what was taken, right? And so you dang all right that to a degree there needs to be parity in opportunities and access and resources, but there's also this idea of quality, as Dr. Purdy outlined for us there. So that's the paradox I struggle with when I think about equal educational opportunity. On one level, yes, we do need to have equal educational opportunity, but on the more I critique and interrogate that, I start thinking about equal to whom, and then why is it that white middle class educational systems have to become the standard by which we all seek to obtain?
And to even push that further, right, when we think about not just race, but when we think about gender as well, sexuality, class, right? And so even though some people would say, well, we have progress in that, you know, on a lot of college campuses now, we have percentages that where, you know, there are more women who, you know, identify as cisgender women, right? Set, you know, percentages higher than males, right, on college campuses. But again, there's still sexism in the United States, right? And then when you begin to trace out those numbers into professional career paths, right, even in law schools and medical schools where the numbers are equal in terms of the binary genders, right, in terms of thinking about, but who does corporate law, right? Who does what particular professions and who's going there? And so I think we have to continue to, and who's made those the standards, right, by which everybody needs to try to achieve. But I think we can think about all of these issues related, and, you know, as Kimberly Crenshaw's named, the intersectionality of it, right? Cool. So, and so it comes down to thinking about how white, male, middle class, heterosexual, you know, Protestant, Christian, the list goes on, English speaking, how that became the norm. And then how, as Dr. Green talked about, how do we reconstruct what that norm is, reframe what that norm is, both in our historical work and as well as our contemporary educational research.
Yeah, so. And I think a really good example of sort of this access and opportunity in connection to curriculum and pedagogy is the La Raza Studies program in Tucson. That was shut down. So even though, like, the purpose of schooling that we've been taught for so long is to increase grades and to become productive citizens, and this program was doing that by basing the curriculum upon the knowledges of the people and the places that were there, right? And these students were engaging in critical consciousness and critical literacy, where they're understanding the whys of how things have come to be in their communities and in their families. And when that happened, even though they were succeeding with the definitions that we've set forth with schooling, right, it was shut down because it was dangerous knowledge, right? It wasn't what you were just talking about, Dr. Purdy, with the heterosexual male Western European. It wasn't within those confines or paradigms. And so even when we are creating a student body that is succeeding in the definitions that we have come to understand, if the knowledge, right, and the ways that we teach that knowledge aren't parallel to the constructs that we're continuing to define or be silenced or invalidate from, then it becomes dangerous, and it goes away. Not to say that legacy, that what they've done hasn't continued in other places like San Francisco, Oakland, Chicago. It still continues, but I think that's a really important case study to look at when we're talking about equal educational opportunity. That we also need to think about the knowledges, the paradigms, the epistemologies that are connected to those.
Thank you, everybody. This is some real powerful stuff, and I have the evidence of that in our chat box, which is just blowing up from audience questions. So I'm going to throw away the rest of our script and hand it off to Shayna, who's going to facilitate questions from the participating audience.
Wow.
Yes, great. Can everybody hear me? I want to make sure I've unmuted myself.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So we have a lot of really great questions, and so just in the interest of time, I have just been looking through them, and I'm trying to synthesize it. And I think what we're going to do is I'm going to ask, I'm going to try to get through as many questions as I can. So I'm just going to ask one professor to address each question, if that's all right. And I've been reading through it and listening to our conversation, trying to make sense of how to connect these questions with the professors. And so this question will go first to Professor Green. So James and Tanya are kind of in the same state of mind here in thinking about what is missing from the scholarship towards connecting with communities, urban, indigenous, colonized, and those that are marginalized outside of academic spaces and discourses of educational scholars. And James is wondering, how can we make these connections and fill these gaps? And kind of as an extension of that, Tanya is asking if you could speak to practical ways that this kind of scholarship is made accessible beyond the confines of the academy, particularly to further serve the communities that helped produce it.
Gotcha. I'll take the first stab, and please feel free to jump in. I definitely think my colleagues have a lot to add to this. So to make sure I kind of understand the question, they're asking, what do I see as like kind of missing connections between research that's working with indigenous populations and how they can benefit from the work that we conduct, in a sense?
Yes, so indigenous, urban, colonized, and other marginalized communities.
Yeah. So I think one, it begins in even how we frame our research. So going back to what Dr. San Pedro said earlier, when we take, these top-down approaches and we come in with our research questions and we come in with our methodologies and we come in with our frameworks, I think we have already missed it there, right? Because then it becomes our research project that, going back to the term you used earlier, that we have to translate to communities versus starting with community and in community and co-constructing questions, co-constructing knowledge, co-constructing the ways in which this information is shared, the ways in which this information is implemented. So I believe a practical thing is, instead of you coming with your research question to communities, is that you exist within communities and you collectively and you co-construct the research experience and the research project. So I think that would be one practical way. For the sake of time, and I'm happy to answer that and go into more detail, you can send me an email. But for brevity's sake, that would be my quick response.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you for opening it up for people to connect with you over email. And so the next question, I think I'm gonna pitch over to Dr. San Pedro. JD Schilling is saying, has asked, I'm currently undertaking research on written legislative policy reform using critical discourse analysis to identify and critique these words or terms that have repeatedly been used and codified in that policy. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this language itself is hindering actual progress for marginalized groups?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just thinking about how epistemologies are tied, so intricately tied to language, right? So I'm thinking of a friend on the Flathead Indian Reservation who's leading a Salish language revitalization school, and she's learning the language as she's leading in this capacity. I'm remembering that she was talking to an elder in the Salish language, and she said, "Can you pass me my water?" Right? And the elder said to her, "That's wrong." And she asked, "Well, why is that?" And she said, "Well, there is no possession in our language, so it's pass me water." Right? Mm. So there's so much connected within language that either limits or allows for like epistemology and ontologies to be forwarded. And I think, sometimes we get so trapped in language, even thinking back to like terms that all of our institutions use, like inclusion, diversity, and just thinking about what does that mean, inclusion. It means that you have an opportunity to be included in what is already established, right? And so I don't think that that we're complicating enough the terms that we use in policy or at our institutions. We really need to distill down what it is that we're meaning by these words and really complicating that. And I think like people who speak multiple languages have such an advantage in seeing how language shapes understandings and cultures. And I think they need to be the ones that help us in forwarding those new languages that will help us envision what it is that we're seeking.
Great, thank you. And to Dr. Purdy, somebody is asking, has the Common Core alleviated some inadequacies in curriculum through a quote-unquote expansion to be a more inclusive curriculum, or not adequately?
I will say, I am, as a historian, I know a little bit about the Common Core. It is not my expertise, but I think what the Common Core tried to do was to have these quote-unquote curriculum standards across the country, such that, if a child moves from one state to the next, right, there are these particular standards. But what I have learned about the Common Core, right, is that the scripting is so narrow, and the ways in which teachers have to implement the Common Core now, and that it is, and that the ways in which we teach, period, right, are so scripted, so based in particular ideologies and epistemologies about how students should learn, that there's even though there might have been spaces for more inclusivity in the curriculum, I still feel like because there's such a push to the test, to the high stakes testing, and we're still in the era of age of accountability, I'm not sure how much the Common Core has alleviated that, right? I have a young student of mine who graduated from here a couple of years ago, and he's doing the Boston Teacher Residency Program. And we met this past spring when he was in town, and he showed me how he has to teach third grade math. And I said, well, where is your agency in how to teach third grade math based on what you know as a teacher and as a, educated, quote unquote, young man, right? And he said, there was no agency. It was so scripted for what he had to do in order to meet particular goals and targets that I think we have taken, we are undermining our teachers. So whether it's the Common Core, whether it's other standardized forms of curriculum, we are undermining the intellectual capabilities of our teachers and our students in many ways. So I hope that helps. I'm happy to talk further and also to recommend other scholars who are looking more closely at the Common Core. So feel free to email me at mpurdy@wustl.edu. And back to the language question around policy, I think you can find historical examples of how language was used, right, whether in Supreme Court decisions or in policy to reinforce, right, particular ideologies of deficit theories, where the onus gets put on the marginalized person as opposed to the onus being put on the dominant population. And so I think we have to, I think there are definitely ways in which you can analyze policy, whether it be actually legislative policy or even Supreme Court decisions to that end.
Great, thank you. And I think I'm going to pitch this question again also to Dr. Purdy. person's asking, some of the work graduate students and faculty members are engaging in use qualitative research strategies such as focus group and focused ethnographic observations to open up moments of critical reflection for white teachers in schools. Of what use do you think this is?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
I'm looking for it on the chat here too.
Yeah, it's getting so long. I've been trying to read through as many as I can. But
Okay.
So it's asked by Sarah Ishmael. She asks, some of the work that graduate students and faculty members are engaging in use qualitative research strategies such as focus groups and focused ethnographic observations to open up moments of critical reflection for white teachers in schools. And of what use do you think this is?
So that kind of goes back to this. I mean, it is paradoxical in some ways, right? As Dr. Green talked about in terms of when we're thinking about equal opportunity. Obviously, the teaching force, right, is predominantly white female. And so we have to be able to engage them on their knowledge that they're bringing to the classroom, on their biases, their prejudices. All of us have biases and prejudices, right? But also on this critical reflection of them understanding who they are in this particular moment in time in the United States, right? And so what does it mean to be a white female? So I do think there is some usefulness in it because they are teaching the children, right? And we want them to be able to engage our children in equitable ways, right? And so when I started off as an assistant professor at Michigan State, I taught a course called TE 250, which is about power, opportunity, and social institutions. And predominantly my students were white, female. And we looked at issues of power and oppression, and we went through understanding race and class and language. And I found that class, even though, many students kind of hemmed and hawed because it's a required course, but I had students 2, 3 years later after I left Michigan State still emailing me to say, you told us we would never think about the world the same again. And they do not. So there has to be engaging work in that way as well. And I think that goes for all teachers, whatever your background is, because unless you fall into all the dominant categories of socialization in the United States, you have identities, right, that are both dominant and subordinate in a society. And you have to come to grips with that and understand that and what that means for how you will employ that in the classroom, in your curriculum, in your pedagogy, and especially how you interact with parents, right? And how you interact with your fellow teachers and administrators. So I do think there's worth in that. I do think we have to continue to push ourselves on teacher education research about who are the foci of our, who are we engaging with? And as, Dr. San Pedro and Dr. Green have pushed us all to think about who are we in community with around these research groups? Why are we doing? What are the questions that we're asking? But I do think there's some worth in it, definitely.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So our last question, I want to actually open up to all of our professors again, because I think it's really relevant to the last question. And Jennifer Higgs, so she's asking, so research shows us that the teacher education programs are influential and their effects are long-lasting. How do you engage pre-service teachers in the work of equitable pedagogies? And have you seen examples that are particularly encouraging?
I could start. So I actually teach in our principal preparation program, which I think is, and I'm using this term, equally as important.
Yes, it is.
Because you can have a teacher in a school that's engaged in this critical, democratic pedagogy and instruction, but it can be isolated to that one classroom. And so school leaders become significantly important in thinking about ways to make that institutionalized throughout the entire organization. And so our leadership preparation program at Texas is focused on anti-racist leadership and equitable leadership. And so we teach right at those intersections, right? So we teach about race and class and gender and ability and sexual orientation and how those play into the experiences that children have, but then how do you because we're still talking about working in schools, right? So how do you make the school become equitable for all children, particularly the children on those margins? And so we began from the beginning, like, this is an anti-racist equitable leadership preparation program. And this is, I mean, because even folks, you know, terms get watered down and you know, they're thrown around all the time. But I mean, it's not, oftentimes when we say we're doing equitable and social justice work, if you peel back the layers on it, you still see the same systemic structural inequalities and segregation and marginalization even behind that. And so that's, we really try to get school leaders to dig into that, but then dig into how do you now work with your faculty who are predominantly white females, which I think, yes, I mean, the reality is that they're the majority of the teaching force. And so, like, we have to engage them. I mean, that's just the reality. I work at a predominantly white institution. Texas is predominantly white. That's just what this context affords us. But I think we try to do it up front, and I don't think it's done in isolation as teachers or leaders. And now that's what we're trying to get to, this integrated approach, because if school leaders are learning about this, but then teachers are learning something completely different, we still have this bifurcation in schools. And so the integration of teacher preparation and leadership preparation around these issues of equity and marginalization and the intersections, I think that's where they could become powerful. Although we're not there yet, that's where we're trying to go.
Yeah, and I was thinking about a course that I teach on campus called Equity and Diversity in Education, and it's for teacher practitioners in many different subjects. And it's sort of this, I call it a checkbox course, right? Where they take one course, check it off the list. They know equity, they know diversity, so they're prepared for the workforce, right? It's a type of course where you have 90 students, and that's a tough environment to learn in. There are some breakout sessions, but you know what? When I first started teaching that course, it was like I taught it in a way where it was like in your face. Where we use Tatum's definition of racism as a moving walkway at an airport. If you're standing still on the moving walkway, you're still part of the racist agenda, right? So even if you're not doing anything, even if you're silent, you're still perpetuating systems of oppression, right? And unless you turn around and walk the opposite way, then you are part of the problem. And so students did not like that right off the get-go. Right? They were not jiving with that whatsoever. And so, you know, I work with 3 to 4 graduate assistants every year. And at the end of the semester, we reflect on, you know, how can we make what it is that we do accessible for students? And one of the things that we came up with is to engage learning as praxis, right? Reflection and action, and then back to reflection, right? Mm-hmm. So if we see students as being filled with histories and knowledges entering into our classroom, then we need to value and validate where they come from before we add layers onto what it is that we're attempting to teach them, right? And so we really do a lot of, you know, giving them space to construct their stories. And my student population is majority white, majority female as well. And one of the questions that I ask them is, you know, why are they there? Right? What happened in their schooling experience that showed them that teaching could be a successful career for them? And what we come to understand is that along the way, they felt the support and the validation from a teacher or a group of teachers who have said, you're good at this, you should do this, you are smart. And then, you know, for the other students who are in my class, we ask them, well, what happened with you or with students who are in your class? And they say something that's very dissimilar to that, where they have felt invalidated, they have felt silenced, they have felt ridiculed in schooling spaces. So why would they want to recreate something that didn't work for them? And so when we get to that, when we understand these experiences of schooling, then we can sort of add these layers on and engage in action projects where we can attempt to create some semblance of small projects that create changes that we want to see in our schools and in other educational spaces.
I think I will be brief. I'm actually, in our department, we're a small department of education, and we offer both educational studies, major and minor, as well as teacher education. And so in the course the 300 level course I teach is called the American School. And I get a mixture of students. So I get some of our teacher education students. I get some of our educational studies major and minors. And I also get students who are taking this class for a distribution requirement or some other type of requirement, right? And so I take the approach of I'm preparing you for whatever it is you want to do. And I'm preparing you to think differently about education than perhaps how you've thought about it in the past. So my hope is that those who want to become teachers take some particular lessons away from the class in terms of how their schooling system that they're a part of came about, right? For my students who are educational studies majors and minors who are looking at multiple institutions and perspectives and disciplines related to the study of education, how this particular class grounds them in historical knowledge in the relationship between history and the past and between history and the present. And then for my students who are taking it for a distribution requirement, who have no desire to be a teacher or to go in the education workforce, how these types of questions that we're asking about equity and who's been given access, who has not been given access, who's been given opportunity, under what conditions, what does that mean for you when you go out into the workforce, right? What does that mean for you as a tax-paying citizen? What does that mean for you to become a parent? What does that mean if your school board, somebody in your community says, hey, you should run for the school board, right? So what are the questions that you're going to be asking about the social context of the schools in which you find yourselves operating? And so I think one strategy that's very helpful, and I learned this from my colleague, Dr. Terry Flannall at Michigan State, is to start class with, and Dr. Green talked about reading widely, right? So starting with The Danger of a Single Story TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie, right? I start most of my classes with that TED Talk. And it opens up the discussion about the power of story and who stories get told and who stories do not get told, and how stories, as she says, are used to dispossess and malign. Because many of our students that we're encountering, right, have had one particular narrative of U.S. history and about what U.S. life is like today. And so by opening class with that video, you begin to open their minds to the fact that some people's stories have never been told because they were disempowered, right? They were not considered a part of the traditional canon. And so that's been one very effective pedagogical tactic. And in some ways, I was a resident advisor when I was a student here. In some ways, I draw on some of those types of skills and activities, right? So Race to the Wall or activities that get them to reflect on their positionality, but that are not so, quote unquote, threatening that they disengage from the class. And so you have to build a level of community and trust. Yep. And I think by focusing on those two key issues as the semester progresses, the deeper you can dig into their critical reflection of who they are and what they feel about anti-racism, equity, opportunity, and access. So.
Wow. Thank you, everybody. We do want to be respectful of everyone's time, although that may be a hegemonic, Eurocentric, oppressive
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Purdy, and thank you, Dr. Green, and thank you, Dr. San Pedro, for sharing your powerful and meaningful, and I think very practical work with us. We do want to shout out a few things to DivG folks. Please continue this conversation on Twitter. We can use the hashtag DivDChat, and if you're not following us yet, we are at AERA DivG. I mean, I know there's probably 6 or 7 more questions we couldn't get to today. So let's keep talking about this. I know all of our professors here are on Twitter, so let's make sure we invite and include them. We have featured one publication from everybody, from Dr. Purdy and Dr. Green and Dr. San Pedro on the DivG Graduate Student Committee blog. And if you want to visit that, that's at aeradivg.wordpress.com. Finally, all DivG members should look out for our student survey, which is going to be coming out in email, and also we'll blast that through Twitter. We thank everybody for your ideas and your insights and for your participation, for being with us this afternoon. We're going to host another webinar in January, and we hope to see you all there. Thanks, everybody. That was great.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.